History loves to pretend that wars end with brilliant strategy and heroic negotiations. But the truth? Some of the dumbest peace treaties ever signed didn't solve a thing. They just made everything messier, weirder, and sometimes straight up hilarious. Today, we're diving into 44 real agreements so pointless they make you wonder how anyone running these countries kept their job. If you think diplomacy is the smart part of history, you're about to rethink everything. 1. The peace treaty ending the Emu War in 1932 is the most embarrassing document in Australian history. The Australian military officially deployed machine guns to fight a massive army of 20,000 emus that were eating crops. Spoiler alert, the birds won. The emus were surprisingly bulletproof and used guerrilla tactics to dodge the soldiers. After wasting thousands of rounds of ammunition and failing to stop the birds, the government had to retreat and basically sign a silent truce with the emus. It remains the only war in modern history where a professional military surrendered to a bunch of flightless birds who did not even know they were at war. 2. You cannot talk about stupid conflicts without mentioning the time Roman Emperor Caligula declared war on the ocean. This was not a metaphor. He literally marched his powerful army to the beach in Gaul and ordered them to attack the waves because he was angry at Neptune, the sea god. The soldiers had to throw spears at the water and stab the sand, looking incredibly confused. The peace treaty to end this glorious campaign involved the soldiers collecting seashells as spoils of war to prove they conquered the Atlantic. It was the only military victory in history where the enemy was saltwater and the war trophies belonged in a souvenir shop. 3. The end of the Austro-Prussian War in 1866 gave us the most wholesome military failure ever involving the tiny country of Liechtenstein. They sent an army of 80 men to guard a mountain pass, and their only job was to sit there and look tough. They saw absolutely zero combat and spent the whole time drinking wine and enjoying the view. When the war ended and they marched home, the commander did a head count and realized he had 81 men. They had made a friend, an Italian officer who decided he liked their vibe so much he just joined them. Liechtenstein is the only country in history to send an army to war and return with negative casualties. 4. The surrender of Guam in 1898 is the most polite misunderstanding in history. During the Spanish-American War, a U.S. cruiser sailed into Guam and fired a few warning shots at the Spanish fort. The Spanish governor did not fire back. Instead, he sent a rowboat with a letter apologizing profusely for not returning the salute because they were out of gunpowder. He had absolutely no idea a war had started and thought the Americans were just stopping by for a friendly visit. The American captain had to awkwardly explain that they were actually there to conquer him. The governor was so embarrassed by the mix-up that he surrendered the entire island immediately just to end the awkward conversation. 5. The Treaty of Zapolino in 1325 is the punchline to the absolute dumbest joke in military history. The city-states of Modena and Bologna went to war, and thousands of people died in a massive battle. You might think they were fighting over territory or religion, but the actual trophy was a wooden bucket filled with stolen loot. Modena won the battle, and the treaty allowed them to keep the bucket as a symbol of their glorious victory. That is it. The borders barely changed. The politics remained the same, but Modena secured the legal rights to a piece of old gardening equipment. To this day, the bucket is still displayed in a bell tower in Modena, proving that men will literally die rather than return a stolen pail. 6. The Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1785 exists solely because of a soup pot, which makes it the most ridiculous agreement ever. The Holy Roman Emperor was trying to intimidate the Dutch on the Scheldt River, but the only action in the entire conflict was a single shot from a Dutch ship that hit a soup kettle on an Austrian deck. The Austrians surrendered instantly, probably because they were terrified of lunch being ruined. To fix this mess, the Dutch agreed to pay millions of guilders to the emperor, effectively as an apology for the destroyed cookware. It is the only time in history where a major peace treaty and massive financial reparations were negotiated entirely because of a kitchen accident. 7. The aftermath of the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 led to the most humiliating defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte's life, and it wasn't against an army. To celebrate the peace treaty, his staff organized a rabbit hunt and bought thousands of tame farm rabbits instead of wild ones. When the rabbits were released, they did not run away. They thought Napoleon was the guy bringing them food, so a fluffy horde of thousands of bunnies charged at the most powerful man in Europe. They swarmed his legs and climbed his jacket. The conqueror of nations had to flee in his carriage, defeated by a swarm of hungry pets, proving that nature does not care about your diplomatic victories. 8. The Battle of Karansebes in 1788 is what happens when an army defeats itself before the enemy even shows up. The Austrian army was scouting for Ottoman forces, but instead they found some locals selling schnapps. The scouts got drunk, refused to share with the infantry, and a fistfight started. Someone shouted "Turks," causing a panic. In the dark, the drunk Austrian soldiers started shooting at each other, thinking the enemy had arrived. The emperor himself had to run away into a creek. The resolution to this disaster was simply the army retreating in shame, having lost thousands of men without seeing a single actual enemy soldier. 9. The Whiskey War between Canada and Denmark is the most polite and alcoholic conflict in human history. Both countries claimed a tiny, useless rock called Hans Island. Instead of shooting at each other, the Canadian military would land, plant a flag, and leave a bottle of Canadian whiskey for the Danes. Then the Danish military would arrive, take the whiskey, plant their flag, and leave a bottle of Danish schnapps for the Canadians. This went on for decades. It was a war fought entirely with free booze and passive-aggressive gift-giving, proving that the best way to handle a border dispute is to just get the enemy drunk. 10. The peace treaty ending the Pastry War in 1839 is perhaps the most expensive bakery bill in human history. France blocked Mexican ports and even bombarded a fortress, and it all started because a French pastry chef near Mexico City complained that some officers looted his shop and refused to pay for the cakes. He demanded an astronomical sum for the lost pastries, and the French king agreed that this was a matter of national honor. The final peace treaty forced Mexico to pay 600,000 pesos to France, effectively covering the cost of the most overpriced croissants ever baked. It remains the only time international borders were threatened solely because a customer refused to pay for his dessert. 11. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace from 1502 has the most hilariously inaccurate name in the history of naming things. Scotland and England decided to stop fighting forever and sealed the deal by marrying King James IV to Margaret Tudor. It was supposed to be the ultimate family reunion that solved everything. But perpetual apparently meant about 10 years in royalty time because Henry VIII decided to pick a fight with France. Since the Scots and French were old buddies, James ignored his fancy peace paper and attacked England anyway. The Treaty of Eternal Love instantly turned into a total disaster, proving that putting the word perpetual on a political document is basically just daring the universe to prove you wrong immediately. 12. The Treaty of Wuchale in 1889 is a masterclass in why you should really double-check the paperwork before signing it. Italy and Ethiopia made a deal for friendship and trade, but the Italians tried to pull the oldest trick in the book. The Amharic version said the Emperor of Ethiopia could ask Italy for help with foreign diplomacy if he felt like it. The Italian version said he was legally forced to do it, which basically made his whole country an Italian servant. When Emperor Menelik figured out he had been scammed by a bad translation, he did not just complain. He launched a massive war and humiliated the Italians, proving that trying to steal a kingdom using a grammar trick is a terrible business strategy. 13. The Chincha Islands. War in 1864 is the only time in history where nations went to war over literal piles of crap. Spain seized these islands from Peru, not for gold or land, but for guano, bird poop that was used as fertilizer. Spain basically held the poop hostage with warships and demanded a ransom. The conflict ended with a treaty where Peru agreed to pay millions just to get their excrement back. It is the only time in history where international diplomacy revolved entirely around who owned the rights to bird droppings, making it the absolute stinkiest war ever fought. 14. The Treaty of Madrid in 1526 is the ultimate historical example of crossing your fingers behind your back while making a promise. King Francis I of France was stuck in a Spanish prison after losing a battle to Emperor Charles V. To get out of jail, Francis signed a treaty giving up huge amounts of land and even handed over his two sons as hostages to take his place. It sounds like a terrible trade, but Francis had a secret plan. The moment he crossed the border back into France and got on a horse, he shouted that the treaty did not count because he was stressed out when he signed it. He left his kids in prison and started a new war immediately, which is definitely a questionable parenting choice but a legendary diplomatic hustle. 15. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 is what happens when people with zero knowledge of geography try to divide the entire planet. Spain and Portugal were arguing over who got to own the world, so Pope Alexander VI stepped in to help. He literally just drew a random imaginary line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and said, Spain gets the west and Portugal gets the east. The funny part is that nobody knew South America stuck out so far, so Portugal accidentally got Brazil because the Pope was bad at cartography. Meanwhile, the King of France was standing there wondering why he got nothing, famously asking to see the part of Adam's will that said he was not allowed to own any dirt. 16. The Siege of Weinsberg. In 1140 ended with the greatest loophole abuse in history. King Conrad III had surrounded the castle and was ready to destroy everyone, but he made a gracious offer to the women inside. He said the women could leave unharmed and take whatever they could carry on their backs, but the men had to stay and face their doom. The king expected them to take jewelry or clothes. Instead, the castle gates opened, and every single woman walked out carrying her husband on her back. The king's generals were furious at the trick, but Conrad laughed and said a king always keeps his word. He let them all go, proving that a literal interpretation of a contract can save your life if your wife is strong enough to bench press you. 17. The Treaty of Paris. In 1763 contains the absolute worst real estate deal ever made by a government. After losing the 7 Years' War, France sat down to negotiate and had to choose between keeping their massive territory of Canada or holding on to the tiny island of Guadeloupe because it produced expensive sugar. The French diplomats looked at the map of North America, shrugged, and basically said they did not want those few acres of snow anyway. They happily gave away the entire future country of Canada just to keep their dessert supplies secure, proving that a sweet tooth can cost you half a continent. 18. The Treaty of Breda in 1667 is the moment the Dutch won the negotiation but lost at looking into the future. They had captured a small spice island called Run in Indonesia and also occupied a colony in South America called Suriname. To keep these valuable spots, they agreed to let the English keep a remote trading post they had captured in North America called New Amsterdam. The Dutch thought they had scammed the English by keeping the nutmeg and sugar, completely failing to realize they had just traded the island of Manhattan for some spices. They effectively gave away New York City because they thought nutmeg was the most important thing in the universe. 19. The Peace of the Ladies in 1529 happened because the most powerful men in Europe were apparently too immature to be in the same room. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and King Francis I of France hated each other so much that their previous treaties kept falling apart due to their massive egos. Finally, the mother of the French king and the aunt of the emperor decided enough was enough. These two formidable women met in Cambrai, locked the door, and negotiated the entire peace treaty themselves without allowing the men to speak. It was one of the few treaties that actually lasted for a while simply because the moms had to step in and fix the mess their sons made. 20. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 is the ultimate proof that before email existed, diplomacy was just a guessing game. This treaty officially ended the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain, and they agreed to return everything to exactly how it was before the fighting started. It was basically a draw. The hilarious part is that the peace treaty was signed in Europe, and nobody could text the troops in America to tell them to stop. 2 weeks after the war was legally over, Andrew Jackson fought the massive Battle of New Orleans, achieving a legendary victory that technically did not matter at all because the war had already finished. Thousands of people fought for a result that was already decided simply because the mailman was a slow boat. 21. The Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529 is the moment the King of Spain became the greatest scam artist in royal history. This was the sequel to the Tordesillas Treaty, intended to sort out who owned the Spice Islands in the Pacific. King Charles V of Spain generously agreed to sell his rights to these islands to Portugal for a massive pile of gold. The Portuguese were thrilled to finally legally own the source of their precious spices. The punchline is that based on the actual geography, the islands were already on the Portuguese side of the line anyway. Charles essentially sold Portugal something they already owned and walked away with a fortune, proving that you do not need an army to win when you can just hustle your neighbors. 22. The Peace Treaty of 1986 ending the 335 Years' War is the champion of procrastination. In 1651, the Dutch declared war on the Isles of Scilly, a tiny group of islands off the coast of England, because they were angry at some royalist ships parked there. The Dutch Navy showed up, looked around, decided it was not worth the effort, and went home without firing a single shot. The problem is that they completely forgot to sign the paperwork to say the war was over. For over 3 centuries, the Netherlands and these tiny islands were technically at war until a historian noticed the error in 1985. The Dutch ambassador finally flew in to sign a peace treaty, ending a conflict where the only casualty was a lot of wasted time. 23. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 had to be signed to stop a conflict known as the Pork and Beans War, which sounds like a lunch dispute, but was real life. The United States and Britain could not agree on where the border was between Maine and Canada, so they sent lumberjacks into the woods to yell at each other. The situation got tense when the lumberjacks started stealing each other's equipment and, yes, their food supplies. No actual battles were fought, but there were a lot of angry men with axes staring each other down over breakfast. The treaty finally drew a line on the map to separate them, proving that national borders are sometimes defined just to stop people from stealing cans of beans. 24. The Nootka Convention in 1790 saved the world from a massive war caused entirely by a wooden shed. Spain and Britain were ready to unleash their navies on each other because a British captain built a small trading hut on Vancouver Island, and the Spanish dismantled it because they claimed they owned the entire Pacific Ocean. The Spanish king was ready to drag all of Europe into a conflict to defend his honor over a shack that probably cost $5 to build. In the end, France told Spain they were broke and could not help. So Spain had to sign a treaty admitting that Britain was allowed to build sheds wherever they wanted. It was a global crisis narrowly avoided over a pile of lumber. 25. The resolution to the Toledo War in 1836 is the most confusing trade in American state history. Ohio and Michigan both claimed a small strip of land called the Toledo Strip and sent militias to march around in the mud and look scary. The federal government stepped in to stop the madness and forced a compromise. Ohio got to keep the Toledo Strip, and in exchange, Michigan was given the entire Upper Peninsula. At the time, Michigan was furious because they thought they just got a frozen wasteland in exchange for a useful port. They had no idea the new land was full of copper and iron, meaning Michigan accidentally won the lottery while losing the argument. 26. The Convention of Klein-Schnellendorf in 1841 sounds like a spy comedy plot. Austria and Prussia were technically enemies during a war, but their generals met in secret and decided they did not actually want to fight each other. They signed a secret treaty where the Austrians agreed to surrender the town of Nice after a pretend siege that would last exactly 15 days. They literally scripted a fake battle so the Austrian general could surrender with honor, without anyone knowing he made a deal. The troops fired cannons at safe distances and made a lot of noise just to put on a show for the public, proving that sometimes warfare is just very loud theater. 27. The Treaty of London in 1518 was a spectacular failure that tried to outlaw war forever by asking nicely. Cardinal Wolsey came up with a brilliant plan where the major powers of Europe, including England, France, and Spain, all signed a pact promising to defend each other if anyone was attacked. It was supposed to be a league of universal peace. The signatories threw a huge party, celebrated their wisdom, and promised to be best friends. 2 days after the treaty was signed, everyone started plotting against each other again, and within a couple of years they were all back at war. It was the geopolitical equivalent of promising to start a diet on Monday and eating a cake on Tuesday. 28. The peace treaty ending the Crimean War in 1856 forgot one tiny detail that technically left a British town at war with Russia for over a century. The town of Berwick-upon-Tweed was specifically listed in the Declaration of War because of some weird medieval border laws, but the diplomats forgot to include it in the peace treaty. Technically, this meant the little town remained in a state of total war against the massive Russian Empire while the rest of Britain was at peace. The mayor finally signed a symbolic peace treaty with a Soviet diplomat in the 1960s, who reportedly said the Russian people could finally sleep safely now that Berwick was no longer a threat. 29. The resolution to the Lobster War in 1963 was a debate that sounded less like politics and more like a drunk biology class. Brazil and France were ready to fight over who could catch lobsters off the coast of Pernambuco. Brazil claimed lobsters walk on the seafloor, so they belong to the continental shelf, and thus Brazil. France argued that lobsters swim, so they are like fish and belong to the ocean. The argument got so heated that the Brazilian admiral officially stated that if lobsters are fish because they leap, then kangaroos are technically birds. The dispute was eventually settled by expanding territorial waters. But for months, international relations hung on the swimming athletic ability of a crustacean. 30. The Helgoland-Zanzibar Treaty of 1890 is the moment Germany decided to trade a diamond for a pebble. The Germans gave up their claims to the massive, incredibly strategic and spice-rich island of Zanzibar in Africa to the British. In exchange, they got Helgoland, a tiny, windy rock in the North Sea that was slowly eroding into the ocean. The British could not believe their luck, gaining a major trade hub while Germany celebrated getting a small island, mostly famous for bird poop and vacations. It was a geopolitical trade so bad it looked like Germany was trying to lose on purpose. 31. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 ended the War of Jenkins Ear, which is already a hilarious name for a conflict. The war started because a Spanish coast guard chopped off the ear of a British captain named Robert Jenkins, who carried his pickled ear around in a jar as proof. Britain went to war to defend the honor of the ear. After years of fighting and thousands of deaths, the peace treaty was signed, and it completely ignored the ear. The treaty returned everything to the status quo, meaning the entire war was a complete waste of time, and Captain Jenkins never even got justice for his jarred body part. 32. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 included a royal wedding clause that was designed to fail spectacularly. King Louis XIV of France married the daughter of the Spanish king to seal the peace. The deal was that she would give up her claim to the Spanish throne in exchange for a massive dowry of gold paid to France. The French diplomats knew Spain was completely broke and could never pay the money. When the check inevitably bounced, France used the unpaid dowry as a legal excuse to invade Spanish territories later. It was basically a marriage contract written by a loan shark, proving that even royal weddings are just business scams with better cake. 33. The War of the Golden Stool in 1900 had a peace resolution that basically said, "Okay, our bad." The British governor in West Africa demanded to sit on the Golden Stool, which was the most sacred symbol of the Ashanti people, essentially the soul of their nation. He did not know that literally nobody, not even the king, was allowed to sit on it. This ignorance started a massive uprising. The war ended with the British annexing the territory, but the final agreement quietly admitted that the governor would never, ever ask to sit on the chair again. Thousands of people fought just to teach a British guy that he could not use a holy relic as a sofa. 34. The shortest peace treaty ever signed followed the Anglo-Zanzibar War in 1896, which lasted a grand total of 38 minutes. The Sultan of Zanzibar refused to step down, so the British Navy simply waited for the deadline and then opened fire. The palace was destroyed so fast that the war was over before lunch was served. The Sultan ran away in his pajamas, and the treaty was basically just the British walking onto the beach and asking, "Are we done here?" It holds the Guinness World Record for the quickest conflict ever. proving that diplomacy works much faster when you have a very large clock and very big cannons. 35. The Treaty of Graveley Hill in 1782 ended a war that technically never happened but still caused a lot of headaches. This was a conflict between the USA and the tiny Creek Nation tribe over a misunderstanding about land. The Native American chief, the wonderfully named Fat King, met with American diplomats. The treaty was signed solely because the Americans brought a massive amount of whiskey to the negotiations. The Fat King liked the drink so much, he signed away a huge chunk of Georgia just to keep the party going. It is a classic example of don't drink and draft treaties, because you might wake up with a hangover in one less country. 36. The incident of the War of the Stray Dog in 1925 proves that people need to chill out. Tensions were high between Greece and Bulgaria, but the spark was ridiculous. A Greek soldier's dog ran across the border, and when he chased after it, Bulgarian sentries shot him. This escalated into a full-blown invasion where Greece bombed a Bulgarian town. The League of Nations had to rush in like a disappointed parent to stop the fighting. The peace agreement forced Greece to pay £45,000 as an apology, making it the most expensive dog walk in human history. It is the ultimate warning to always keep your pets on a leash near international borders. 37. The failed French invasion of Britain in 1797 ended with the most embarrassing surrender in military history. French troops landed in Wales and saw what they thought was a massive army of British redcoats marching over the hill. They panicked and surrendered immediately without firing a shot. The punchline is that there were no soldiers. It was just a large group of local Welsh women wearing traditional red shawls and tall black hats, who were curious about the noise. The French army was defeated by a fashion mistake, surrendering to a group of grandmas taking a stroll. 38. The Anglo-Swedish War of 1810 is the gold standard for faking it until you make it. Napoleon forced Sweden to declare war on Britain, which was awkward because Sweden and Britain were actually friends and trading partners. So they came up with a brilliant plan. They officially declared war on paper, but secretly agreed not to shoot at each other. The British Navy freely used Swedish ports, and the Swedish government just looked the other way. The war lasted 2 years with 0 battles and 0 casualties, proving that you can satisfy a tyrant just by winking at your enemy and crossing your fingers. 39. The War of the Whiskers. In the 12th century proves that fashion choices can destroy nations. King Louis VII of France decided to shave off his beard to look more modern. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, hated the clean-shaven look so much she called him ugly and demanded a divorce. She immediately married the King of England and gave him her massive French territories. This divorce, caused by a razor, sparked centuries of war between France and England. It is a historical lesson that before you change your style, you should probably check if your spouse is going to start a geopolitical crisis over it. 40. The Cod Wars between the 1950s and 1970s sound like a joke, but Iceland literally defeated the British Royal Navy using scissors. Iceland wanted to expand its fishing waters, so the British sent warships to protect their fishermen. Iceland, which does not even have a military, sent out tiny Coast Guard boats equipped with giant cable cutters. They zoomed around cutting the expensive fishing nets of the British trawlers and running away. The British Navy was helpless against these tactical drive-by snippings. Iceland won every single time, forcing the mighty British Empire to surrender just to save their fish and chip supply. 41. The Flagstaff War in 1845 in New Zealand was basically a game of capture the flag gone wrong. The British put up a flagpole to show they were in charge. A Maori chief named Hone Heke felt insulted, so he chopped it down. The British built a new one, guarded by soldiers. Heke distracted the soldiers and chopped it down again. This happened 4 times. The entire war consisted of the British trying to keep a stick vertical and one guy with an axe constantly knocking it over to make a point. It was less of a military campaign and more of a very expensive prank war. 42. The conflict between Montenegro and Japan is the war that bureaucracy forgot. In 1904, Montenegro declared war on Japan to support Russia, their big ally. They sent a few volunteers, but when the war ended, everyone forgot to include Montenegro in the peace treaty. Technically, they remained at war with Japan for over 100 years simply because nobody checked the paperwork. They finally signed a peace deal in 2006, ending a century-long conflict where the only actual fighting was probably against boredom. 43. The Llívia War involves a tiny village in Spain that decided to take on a superpower. In 1883, the King of Spain was insulted by a mob while visiting Paris. The mayor of Llívia, a village with about 300 people, was so furious that he officially declared war on the entire nation of France. The town council signed a document threatening to invade France with their tiny local militia. France, obviously, did not notice or care. The town remained at war for 93 years until the King of Spain visited in 1981, and the mayor finally agreed to sign a peace treaty with the French consul, ending the most one-sided intimidation attempt in history. 44. The treaty following the Battle of the Eclipse in 585 BC is the only peace deal caused by the moon photobombing the sun. The Medes and the Lydians had been fighting a brutal war for 5 years, and nobody was winning. Suddenly, right in the middle of a battle, a total solar eclipse happened, and the sky went pitch black. Both armies were absolutely terrified, thinking the gods were deleting the sun because they were angry about the fighting. They dropped their weapons instantly, hugged each other, and signed a peace treaty right there on the battlefield. It remains the only time in history where international peace was achieved simply because nobody had a calendar to know the moon was just passing through. Now, I need you to settle something that history clearly never could. Out of all these disasters, which peace treaty do you think caused more damage than the war itself? And would you honestly trust any of these leaders to negotiate your phone bill? Drop your answer, argue about it, fight over it. I'm reading every unhinged comment. And if you want more videos where history exposes itself as the world's longest-running comedy show, hit subscribe and drop a like. Don't make a treaty about it. Just do it properly, unlike everyone in this video.